Hi everybody, welcome to the first of many vodcasts in our look at human anatomy and physiology. We're going to begin this by having an overview of the hierarchy of multicellular organisms, how we're put together on a basic level, and then get into some of the fundamental ideas of feedback mechanisms, and from there work our way, into the organism itself, from the tissue level and into a few of the organ systems that we have. So in this first one, we're going to be focusing on some of the information found in chapter 28 of your textbook. So feel free to pause and go grab that so you can sort of thumb through as we're talking through this, because you're going to want to take a look at that chapter as well. So without further ado, back in what I think was actually vodcast number 1 of the year, we talked a little bit about this idea of the structural hierarchy that's involved in living systems. And we have this way that we can look at most multicellular organisms and see that they're put together in a very systematic way. And so just to review that, because this is something we have mentioned, but it's been a while, we begin at the most basic unit of life, right? So the cell. And cells carry out very particular functions. We have, as humans, 220 different cells. So that's how many different types of cells we have. And which is interesting to think about, since we all started out as a single cell, that from that single cell derived 220 different cell types. And, now of those cell types, we have trillions. But anyway, that's where it goes. When I have a group of cells that work together for a common function, we call that group of cells and the stuff that goes with it tissues, okay? They interact in a way to complete a task. Okay, so if you can imagine muscle tissue, right, is like that, or nervous tissue, bone is a tissue, and even blood is a tissue. So we'll get into looking at some of those, and we're going to be exploring some of these tissues in the lab. When we have a bunch of tissues interacting with one another, then we have an organ. And we'll look at some of the more specific organs of some of our major systems and, talk about them, do a little dissection of some of them, and that's how we have an organ. And then, again, we take a bunch of organs and we work them together and we get that organ system. So we'll overview them and talk specifically about a couple. Also within this hierarchy, we can look at the differences between an organism growing versus an organism developing. Okay, you might not think that there's a big difference there, but really there is. So with growth, we're talking about something increasing in size, getting bigger, right? And with development, that implies change. Okay, so while something might grow and get larger, okay, the development piece has changed. And these two pieces are very interlaced. They're very connected. Challenges. Life has challenges, in case you didn't know. And some of them, it's, so fundamental. Okay, so what are the basic things that life requires? Okay, well, all living things need to have a method for gas exchange. Okay, why? We need, we need oxygen, right? We need to get rid of carbon dioxide. Okay, why do we need to do these things? Okay, because we need energy. And we, discussed this kind of early on in the year as well, that the idea of energy, right, is what drives pretty much everything we do. Has to do with being able to acquire the energy we need to do the work we need, all the way back to the cell level. Cells can't function if they can't do work. So our gas exchange piece is ultimately for energy. We need ATP. So we need to be able to pull in oxygen to get that to our cells. We need to get rid of the carbon dioxide that is the waste that is produced from, the conversion and the creation of ATP. We also need to ensure transport of materials both throughout a cell and across cells. To get oxygen to our bloodstream has to cross a few cell layers to do so. And what we've learned over the course of the year is that this internal transport is really important, and because we need to make things like diffusion and energy acquisition, right, efficient. We want to make sure we're not wasting any kind of energy to get something done. So we want it as streamlined as possible. And we also need to make sure concentration gradients are balanced well. And so we have this mechanisms that constantly are regulating and monitoring, if you will, that exchange of solutes and the balance of water, because we know how important concentration gradients are, right? And, you know, so a lot of these things we've spent the year up till now talking about in sort of these pieces, we're going to pull together into seeing how they work, you know, in conjunction to help meet these challenges that life has. And of course, that communication from cell to cell is ultimately really vital, okay? How are cells in essence speaking to one another? And that comes through chemical signals. It comes through how hormones are, you know, the cell targets that hormones have. And you guys are going to get a pretty neat look and become, you know, sort of mini experts on various hormones in the coming weeks. All right, so homeostasis. You've heard this word. We've talked about it a lot. It is critical that organisms be able to maintain stable conditions. And those stable conditions vary even within us, right? We have a particular homeostasis we have to maintain, let's say in our stomach versus in our small intestine versus in our bloodstream, right? For pH homeostasis, these vary. And how are we doing that? And what is the, you know, how is this being communicated throughout the organism? So things like body temperature balance, interstitial fluid concentration, and what that means is the fluids that surround our tissues and our organs. Blood pressure is even something that's monitored pretty heavily. You know, and these are all things in us, and you can probably think, as you're thinking of other organisms, you know, you're probably going through the process of thinking of other animals, of thinking of, you know, even fish and birds and other mammals and stuff like that. But what about plants? They're living too, right? And even plants have to be able to maintain this internal environment. And there's, you know, it's actually really neat and fascinating to look at how plants are able and capable of sending out signals and hormones as well and things like that to maintain their homeostasis levels, okay? So this involves a very choreographed network of receptors, integrators, and effectors. So let's talk about what that means. All right. Everything that happens is the direct result of some form of external stimulus, okay? You walk outside on a really cold day, temperature drops, okay? That, all right, is an external stimulus, okay? Body is going to have to register the fact that the temperature is really cold, and how is your body going to respond to that, okay? So we can look at this from general terms, okay? Stimulus enters the system, okay? It's going to first be received by a receptor. Okay, so the stimulus comes in, the receptor notes the change. Okay, so this could be our nerve endings in the skin that are going to detect the change in the temperature, right? These are then going to send a signal, okay, to an integrator, okay, such as our brain, our spinal cord, through mainly the nerves, could be sent through bloodstream. Okay, so we have a connected highway system in our body of either the bloodstream pathways through vessels, nervous system pathways, and that transport system from the receptor, that signal that gets sent, hits the integrator. Okay, so this could be our brain, our spinal cord, right? Whether it's through the blood or not. So we hit the integrator next. Then that sends a signal to the effector, okay? Why? Because it's going to cause an effect, or in other words, a response. So the effector might be a muscle, might be a gland, might be something that's going to respond by releasing something. Wow, I, eat a bunch of food. All right. My receptors signal the fact that as my stomach's breaking it down and as my small intestine's absorbing, glucose, and the glucose is now traveling through the bloodstream, I'm getting a receptor that blood glucose levels are going up. Okay, that's going to send signals back to my brain, which sends signals down to my pancreas. Okay, and the effector is my pancreas, which acts as a gland to then secrete insulin out to be able to mobilize blood, or to be able to mobilize my cells to pull glucose in. And so that's how we get the change from the stimulus. And it's amazing. It's amazing how fast these happen. Okay, so that change gets fed back. Okay, and if that change is enough and sufficient to make do, it will actually signal back to that receptor and shut things down, which is pretty cool. Okay, so this constant connection we have with our environment is vital to maintaining our internal stability. Okay, so we have to make sure that I guess really exchange of information is happening. So negative feedback mechanisms. This is kind of what I just alluded to. A negative feedback loop is going to actively alter the condition in the internal environment and in response return a system to AKA normal. Okay, so I'm going to purposefully alter, that way I can return back. Okay, so example, think about your furnace in your house, right, and the thermostat. Okay, furnace kicks on, okay, right, it pulls the heat up in your house to a particular setting. The thermostat then recognizes when it hits, when it goes above that, sends a signal back to the furnace to shut off. Okay, and the furnace is shut off till the temperature drops again. When it hits that particular temperature, a signal is sent to turn the furnace back on. Okay, we have this sort of similar mechanism going on in our bodies that regulate our body temperature. Example, blood glucose regulation, and I just talked about this a minute ago. Okay, blood glucose levels rise, okay, get too high, kick back, we produce insulin, insulin goes, cells pull glucose in, blood glucose levels drop. That drop in blood glucose will kick back to shut off insulin production. So it's this, constant stream and circle of information that goes around. Body temperature regulation. Skin receptors detect the actual temperature change. Okay, so here's the temperature change. Okay, the integrator is the hypothalamus, which is a region of our brain. I'm going to mention the hypothalamus a few times throughout this. So here's what you have to think. If you want to know where the hypothalamus is located, it sounds really weird. Go directly between your eyes, okay, like this. And if you feel in the back of your head, everybody know you got that bump back there, right? If you feel right at the base of your skull, okay, that bump, which is more pronounced in some people than others, is called the occipital protuberance. Good word, right? And if I were to go directly at that occipital protuberance in the center of my head, center of my eyes, okay, and if I were to if I were able to do this, go directly into my head, the direct center where my fingers touch from those 2 points, boom, okay, that's where your hypothalamus is located. And it's this very, very tiny region of the brain, and it's a hugely important piece in our ability to regulate and feed back information throughout our body. So we're going to hear about this region of the brain a lot, and it's tiny. So that hypothalamus is like our thermostat, senses the change, okay, and will send either signals to the pituitary gland to other glands, okay, that'll send out particular signals. It's also going to carry out different aspects of our body, like depending on if it's a hot or cold change, how our body's going to respond to that temperature change. And you can see some of these listed here. Okay, so take a second and kind of look at some of these responses. Ultimately, though, the big idea is that if this is a particular, really hot day, okay, hot day is what we're looking at, temperature goes way up, ultimately, okay, things like this will allow my temperature to drop, okay, because we don't want things to overheat. We know how bad heat is for things like proteins, right? So temperature falls, and then it goes back up here, and it's going to shut down this process. Probably ought to really make this look like a big X. It's going to shut her down, all right? And so once it's shut down, you know, then we continue this process of back and forth to maintain those regulation pieces. Now, besides negative feedback mechanisms, there's also positive. And what positive does is it starts a chain of events, which we're not talking about returning back to normal, but we're going to intensify the change. We want to push it away from that normal. This is a matter of actually increasing instability in a system. Okay, so something's going to actually drive or push a particular response away from the norm. Okay, now what that does is it actually will reverse the change, okay, only after a particular moment of time. So one of these, and we'll talk very specifically about these in the upcoming weeks, is neuron action potentials. How a nervous signal actually runs the length of a neuron, which is a single nerve cell. Okay, how does that signal go across? And it has to do with these positive feedback. Something intensifies so much that it pushes away, which is what we want ultimately, to send a signal, but then reverts back to the original on its own. Labor and contractions through the production of oxytocin do the same thing. We heighten the amount of oxytocin, which pushes labor contractions and really stimulates that contraction piece. And lastly, I don't want to forget about plants, because they have some of these hormone mechanisms as well, okay? They have ways to resist their change, system-acquired resistance, as it's called. Compartmentalization. This is where a plant, right, can actually shut down areas of itself, and to conserve resources, but still maintain life. That's what's really neat. I guess in essence, it would be like us, shutting down our arm and allowing it to die so that the rest of us, the rest of our body maintains. And then plants have hormones. They have things like hormones that will be released based on how much light's coming in, based on gravitational pull, okay? Believe it or not, there's hormones that allow the plant to know what's up from down, right? If you've ever wondered, how does a plant know? You've ever seen a tree growing on the side of a hill, right? It kind of comes out, but it curves up, right? How does it know up from down? It's all from plant hormone pieces. So, and then there's, lastly, selective transpiration of water. And what that means is how the plant is actually going to draw water up, okay? Draw water up and out the leaves, okay? Because as we know, for photosynthesis, right, water is a pretty big ingredient and can't happen without it. So plants have to have these mechanisms to be able to know how much water to pull in, how much water it will be willing to release out its leaves. And so it's some neat stuff, okay? So with that, we're going to finish up on today's particular vodcast. And unfortunately, as much as I would love to spend more time on plants, our focus in this sort of survey unit of anatomy and physiology is really going to focus on mammalian. And we'll do a little comparative mammalian anatomy and physiology, and comparative vertebrate anatomy as well. So we're not going to limit it to mammals. We'll talk a little bit about things like amphibians and reptiles and how their physiological differences, what kinds of differences they have. So I look forward to a really neat unit, and be ready for a whole lot of lab work and some really neat stuff. So take it easy, have a great night, and we'll catch you later in class.